Alright guys, we're back with another list. I'm gonna get myself in more trouble. I got absolutely creamed on the previous top 10 list I did. So let's have some more fun. As always with these, I love it when you guys give me your list. But, you know, what we're doing today I thought would be fun. Top 10 movies of each year from the 1980s. Now, you might see some bleed over, and again, this is a different day. If you're like me, every day your mind just kind of is wired just slightly different from the last. So you may think of something different today than you did when you made or when you watched the previous list or when I did the previous list, so to speak. But let's have some fun. Let's do it. 1980 through 1989, the best movie from each year. Here we go. Coming up at 1980, I mean, there's a lot you could go with, but for me, everything that I started to talk about, I instantly reverted back to this movie, The Shining. I mean, I'm sorry, Stephen King. I understand that that was your book. I get it. But I can't deny it. I like what Kubrick did so much. It's one thing to have a dad that's like a good guy going up there to this hotel, but clearly Jack Nicholson was already messed up in the head before even taking the job. It was the perfect storm, and I love The Shining. I love what Kubrick did, and I'm still learning about this movie. The fact that, I don't know why I never noticed this before, but throughout the movie you'll see Jack barely look at the camera in moments, but he actually makes contact with the audience, and I'm just like, wow, he does do that. I just took it as, I don't know, I didn't notice it, I guess. But yeah, amazing movie. I love it. I'm still learning about The Shining after all these years. Rest in peace, Shelley Duvall. She was amazing in this film. And there's still a lot of subtext about this movie that I wonder about. Clearly, Jack was a messed up dad, but was he physically abusive to Danny? In more ways than one, if you know what I'm saying. That's another argument. There's a lot of people that think he was. Also, what was up with the bear? Anyway, my point is, The Shining, masterpiece. I love it. As I get older, I love it even more. What else is there to say? Alright guys, coming in at 1981, this is where I love this movie. I could not say it. The master Lucio Fulci's The Beyond. I mean, The Beyond to me has to be one of the most painfully grotesque, evil movies I've ever seen. The thing I love about Fulci is he doesn't operate on a reality that's unlike anybody else's, or a fantasy that's unlike anybody else's. In a Fulci movie, things could be perfectly fine, and then the next moment, the most nightmarish thing happens in broad daylight. In this movie, there are haunting images that have stuck with me since the first time I saw it. Like, underneath the house, there's a scene where these bodies just float out of the ground in this disgusting black water. And there's this disturbing scene where a kid sees a body fall down to the floor in this room, and this acid just slowly drips on the face, melting it. It's something so out of a nightmare. I mean, Fulci would have made one of the best Nightmare on Elm Street movies ever, in my opinion, had he been able to do so. Obviously, there's a culture and language barrier there to a certain extent, but my point is, nobody could do a nightmare sequence like Lucio Fulci. And every day, The Beyond gets closer to being my favorite Fulci movie. Of course, Zombie's my favorite, but The Beyond is the movie that, when you remember it, you say to yourself, oh god, I forgot, that one is that good. Alright guys, coming in at 1982, I could joke around and say I went back with this and I went to this one, but for God's sakes, the answer for me is John Carpenter's The Thing. I mean, I love Halloween 3 as well, and of course it's my favorite Halloween film, so I partially wanted to put it on there. To me, The Thing is far and away John's best movie. After that, of course, would be Halloween. But I think that The Thing is a movie that still till this day, even 40 plus years later when you watch it, it's so impressive. The effects work in this one somehow looks better than almost anything around that time, much less stuff that's coming out today on bigger budgets. I'm not going to compare The Thing to like modestly budgeted movies made today, but I will compare it to movies that cost a ton of money today. The effects work on The Thing still, in my opinion, beats a majority of the crap we see today. The difference between practical effects and CGI effects is, for some reason mentally, when I see a practical effect done really, really well, my brain accepts it and loves what it sees. But when I see CGI done really, really well, and they get really, really close to it looking real, something inside of me gets angry because I know it's not real and I'm being tricked. I guess the physical nature of practical effects bypasses that weird feeling I have in my head. But without a doubt, I will take practical effects magic over CGI crap any day of the week. And The Thing, to me, is still the standard bearer of how good real effects can be. 1983 was a tough one, and I don't know if a lot of people are going to agree with me on this one, but this is how much I love this movie, and I think it's that good. If you ask me about Stephen King movies, one of the best ones, in my opinion, has to be The Dead Zone. I love this movie so much. Christopher Walken has something happen to him that would honestly be so haunting. Imagine if you could see things that you weren't there for. The responsibility of that would be terrifying. There's a lot of movies where you can make a subject about this and it's a comedy, or it's an adventure movie, or it's some other type of movie. But in reality, the responsibility and danger of knowing things you weren't around for would be terrifying. I think The Dead Zone is one of the best Stephen King movies ever made, and it actually has the levity on screen of what it would be like had this been real. Just like the ending, you basically would have to just throw your own life away to help people if you knew something that was going to happen. With that being said, I don't think you get much better than The Dead Zone. There are some, but most of them, in my opinion, they don't touch The Dead Zone. 1984 was another tough one. So much of me wanted to say A Nightmare on Elm Street. It really did. And I know a lot of you will probably say that, and I'm not going to argue it. But in my opinion, one of, if not the greatest slasher films ever made is Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. I look at that as such this main event movie. I really do. I don't watch The Final Chapter that often. Once a year at most. And there's even a couple of years where I probably skipped it. But every time I watch The Final Chapter, I'm reminded of taking that subgenre and bringing it to a pinnacle. A lot of people look at the slasher genre's heyday as about 1980 to 1983. Well, if you go one more year up to 84, that's where I think The Final Chapter just culminates it perfectly. Every character is so memorable. The scenes are all great, and Ted White as Jason is undeniably fierce. I just think it's the best. I think The Final Chapter is one of, if not the greatest slasher films ever made. I had to put it at 1984. Without a shadow of a doubt, the best year of 80s horror, in my opinion, is 1985. Talk about some of the best movies of all time. Day of the Dead, Fright Night. I mean, the list goes on. And partially, some of you could see this as bias on my point, but I just say, if you don't believe me, go watch it compared to the other movies I've already said. My answer is still and always going to be The Return of the Living Dead. I just think Dan O'Bannon made the greatest horror comedy of all time. Yes, better than Texas Chainsaw 2, better than Dead Alive, you name it. The Return of the Living Dead is the most individualistic movie I've ever seen. There's a reason it's my favorite horror movie of all time. You've got an iconic zombie with Tarman, you've got characters that you will never forget from first viewing, and scenes that will stick with you. Send more paramedics, to Tarman taking off Suicide's head. Every scene is iconic, and even the comedy stuff to me just makes me laugh so much. Lamb chops, I had them for lunch. I mean, everything of this movie is perfect. I think Return of the Living Dead is that damn good. Forget the fact it's my favorite movie of all time. Watch it and tell me it doesn't still hold up. As good as Day of the Dead is, as good as Fright Night is, and other movies, I still think Return of the Living Dead is the greatest of all time. 1986 was a difficult one too. I mean, there's some great movies of this year, and oddly enough, my favorite of this year is a remake. Now, some of you will probably say, okay, I can see that, and some of you may disagree on this, but Cronenberg's The Fly just stands the test of time. I saw this movie when I was really young, and for some reason it truly bothered me. Something about seeing Brundlefly on the roof completely covered in this tarry dark skin as a human fly just disturbed me. Talking about insect politics, something I've never forgotten, and also the way he eats his food by regurgitating on it to kind of melt it down. Oh god. The Fly is amazing, but the maggot scene is something that has haunted me since I was a little kid. It ruined my childhood. I couldn't sleep for days after seeing The Fly. I don't think Cronenberg ever really topped this movie, if you want my honest opinion. That could get me in a little bit of trouble, but hey, Videodrome's great. I love Scanners, but The Fly, I mean, come on. Alright guys, so with 1987, I went back and forth on a few movies. I've admitted that even though I'm not the biggest Evil Dead 2 fan, there's no denying that it's one of the greatest sequels of all time, especially for the 80s. But I really think, if you boil it down and you asked 100 people, I think one of the answers and rightfully so, would be A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 Dream Warriors. And as inventive and creative as Evil Dead 2 is, I think you could argue that it's just the same, if not even slightly more, with Dream Warriors. Another independent studio at the time, making one of the biggest movies ever. Remember, New Line was a small indie in the 80s. They weren't considered a major studio, so that's also something to factor into this. Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 not only surpassed Part 2 in money, but it was whipping everybody else's ass at the box office. This is why Freddy's the best. Yeah, Dream Warriors is undeniably great. I mean, this is also where Freddy started to tiptoe into comedy, but honestly, it was a perfect blend at that point, because when he says, "Welcome to primetime, bitch," he isn't laughing. He still looks pretty freaking pissed off. I think if you're going to show somebody 10 movies from the 80s, kind of like what this list is doing, I would assume a lot of you guys would have Dream Warriors on your list as well. Alright guys, so 1988, I went back and forth on this, but ultimately I had to go with what my favorite movie is of the year, period. If you know me, when the name Lance Henriksen gets mentioned, you know I get real excited. He's one of my favorite actors of all time. You gotta throw in Pumpkinhead at 88. Now, there are other movies you could go with, I'm sure, but for me, you look at Pumpkinhead as the pinnacle of practical effects, creature feature monster designs. I mean, after this, things would start to slowly change and CGI would creep in, but this is just the tippy top of great practical effects. I think this is one of the best creature features. I love Pumpkinhead, and I love the story too. It's kind of almost a precursor to something like Pet Sematary, if you will, but on the other side, instead of bringing somebody back, it's really getting revenge. So I think it's a great movie. I think it's a great, almost folktale-ish horror movie that just works so well, and it's easily a yearly Halloween watch. Pumpkinhead, I always got your back. 1989, guys, was pretty easy, and if it's cliche, forgive me, but it's got to be Pet Sematary. The scene in Pet Sematary that bothers me more than anything is that funeral scene. It is so uncomfortable. Every time I watch it, I kind of wince in pain a little bit. The grandpa just freaking out on the dad about the kid dying, and then everybody freaking out, the casket slipping. It's just, God, it's painful. There's a vibe to Pet Sematary that's just iconic. When you watch the movie always envelops the room so much. It's got such a perfect story about love, the grief of loss, what we would do for somebody that we would lose. And it's something that I think we could all probably relate to. We've all lost at some point in our lives, and I think we would probably do almost anything to bring them back sometimes. So, just a perfect movie. It just works. And I love Pascal. Those kind of zombie-like ghost characters, I am a sucker for him every time. Love his character. Pascal's a big win for me. So, call it cliche, call it what you will, but I think 89's got to be Pet Sematary. But guys, that's it. That's the top horror movie of every year of the 1980s for me. I can't wait to see which ones you guys agree with, don't agree with, and what your list is. Let me know down below. For now, this is your old pal CHH. If you enjoyed the video, drop a thumbs up on it. If you haven't checked me out before, hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you guys, and I'll see y'all next time. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.